In the winter of 1828, they dug up 12 graves in Black Hollow Cemetery. 8 coffins bore the desperate scratches of fingernails on wood. In one, they found a man with soil-filled lungs and eyes still wide with terror. But the Blackwood family had vanished into the Pennsylvania wilderness, taking their shovels and their secrets with them. The bitter wind of February 1828 carried more than snow through the skeletal branches of Black Hollow Forest. It carried whispers, hushed conversations that died the moment strangers approached, nervous glances exchanged between townspeople, and the persistent haunting sound that had plagued the small Pennsylvania settlement for months, the ringing of burial bells. Thomas Hartwell pulled his wool coat tighter as he guided his horse down the muddy main road of Black Hollow. As the newly appointed circuit judge, he had traveled from Philadelphia to investigate what the local magistrate had described in his urgent letter as disturbing irregularities in our burial practices. The letter had been vague, almost deliberately so, but the tremor in the handwriting suggested genuine fear. The town itself seemed to crouch beneath the weight of perpetual twilight. Even at midday, the towering pines blocked most sunlight, leaving the settlement in a green-tinted gloom that made everything appear sickly and unnatural. Wooden houses lined the dirt road like crooked teeth, their windows dark and unwelcoming. At the far end of town, barely visible through the mist, stood the imposing Blackwood Mansion, a 3-story Victorian structure that seemed to lean forward, as if listening to every conversation in the streets below. Judge Hartwell's first stop was the town inn, where he hoped to gather information before announcing his official presence. The innkeeper, a nervous man named Edmund Pike, served him stew with hands that shook noticeably. "You're here about the bells, aren't you?" Pike whispered, glancing toward the door. "Everyone knows, but nobody talks. Not since the Hendricks family disappeared." "What bells?" Hartwell asked, though he suspected he already knew. Pike's voice dropped to barely audible. "The burial bells, sir, they ring at night, sometimes for hours. Old Silas Blackwood says it's just the wind, but..." He paused, listening. In the distance, so faint it might have been imagination, came the tinkling of a small bell. "There it goes again." The judge set down his spoon. "That's coming from the cemetery, from under it, sir. From under the ground." That evening, Judge Hartwell made his way to the Protestant cemetery that lay beyond the town's eastern border. The Blackwood funeral home and carpentry shop sat adjacent to the graveyard, its workshop windows glowing with warm lamplight. Through the glass, he could see the silhouette of someone working. The steady rhythm of hammer on wood suggested coffin making even at this late hour. The cemetery itself was surprisingly well maintained. Neat rows of headstones stretched into the darkness, many bearing recent dates. Too many recent dates, Hartwell noticed. For a town of perhaps 200 souls, Black Hollow seemed to suffer an unusually high mortality rate. As he walked between the graves, reading inscriptions by moonlight, the judge began to notice peculiarities. Several headstones bore the same death date, unusual for anything other than epidemic or disaster. Others showed deaths of young, healthy individuals with no apparent cause listed. But most disturbing were the thin ropes he discovered tied to small stakes driven into the ground near several graves. "Those are bell cords, Judge." Hartwell spun around to find a tall, gaunt man emerging from the shadows near the workshop. Even in the darkness, the family resemblance was unmistakable. This had to be one of the Blackwoods. The man's pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, and his dark eyes held an intelligence that felt predatory. "Silas Blackwood," the man introduced himself with a slight bow. "I assume you're the judge from Philadelphia. Word travels fast in small towns. Mr. Blackwood, I was admiring your comprehensive services. You handle both the coffin making and the burials? A family tradition spanning 3 generations. My father brought the practice from the old country, Moravia specifically. We believe in providing complete care for the deceased and their families during their time of grief." Hartwell gestured toward the bell cords. "And these ropes?" Silas's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A precaution against premature burial, Judge. Unfortunately common in cases of catalepsy, deep unconsciousness, or certain fever-induced states. The cord runs through the coffin to a bell above ground. Should someone awaken after interment, they need only pull the rope. Have they ever been used?" "Occasionally. Usually false alarms, settling of the body, decomposition gases, that sort of thing. Though we always investigate when a bell rings naturally." A gust of wind swept through the cemetery, and somewhere in the darkness, a bell chimed softly. Both men turned toward the sound. "Just the wind," Silas said quickly. "The ropes sometimes catch on the wooden stakes." But Judge Hartwell noticed something that made his blood chill. The night was perfectly still. Not even the slightest breeze stirred the pine branches. And the bell had rung 3 times in deliberate succession, hardly the random pattern wind would create. "Mr. Blackwood, I'll be conducting formal interviews with your family tomorrow. I trust you'll make yourselves available?" "Of course, Judge. Though I should mention, my daughter Miriam has been quite ill lately. Female hysteria, the doctor believes. Her testimony might not be reliable." As Hartwell walked back toward town, he heard the bells again. This time he counted at least 4 different tones ringing in what sounded disturbingly like a desperate rhythm. Behind him, he could hear Silas Blackwood's footsteps crunching through the frozen grass, moving toward the source of the sounds. The judge paused at the cemetery gate and looked back. In the workshop window he could see a woman's silhouette, tall, angular, and perfectly still. Even from this distance he could feel her watching him. The woman raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning, then stepped back into the shadows. As he reached the inn, Edmund Pike met him at the door. "Did you hear them tonight, Judge? The bells?" "I heard something. Mr. Pike, how long has the Blackwood family operated the funeral home?" "Near 15 years now. Came here after some trouble back east. Massachusetts, I think. But Judge..." Pike's voice became urgent. "There's something you should know. Young Samuel Henderson, he works part-time digging graves for the Blackwoods. He came to me last week, terrified. Said he heard knocking from inside a grave while he was working nearby. When he told Silas about it, Silas threatened to have him arrested for disturbing the peace of the dead." "What happened to this Samuel Henderson?" Pike's face went pale. "He disappeared 3 days ago. His family found a note saying he'd gone to seek work in Pittsburgh, but Samuel couldn't read or write, Judge. And his mother swears someone was digging in the cemetery that same night." Judge Hartwell felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February air. As he climbed the stairs to his room, he could hear the bells again, a mournful, desperate sound that seemed to carry a message he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. From his window, he could see lights moving in the cemetery. Lantern light, bobbing between the headstones like earthbound spirits. Someone was working in the graveyard at midnight, and Judge Hartwell suspected it wasn't grave maintenance. He watched until the lights disappeared, then sat at the small desk to begin writing his preliminary report. But as his pen touched paper, a sound made him freeze, the distinct, unmistakable sound of a shovel biting into frozen earth coming from the direction of the cemetery. The bells had fallen silent, but somehow, that silence was far more terrifying than their ringing had been. Dawn brought no relief to Judge Hartwell's growing unease. He had barely slept, tormented by the sounds of midnight digging and the image of those moving lanterns in the cemetery. As he dressed, he noticed that fresh snow had fallen during the night, and that a clear trail of footprints led from the cemetery directly past his window toward the Blackwood mansion. His first official interview was scheduled with Miriam Blackwood, Silas's eldest daughter. Despite her father's warnings about her mental state, Hartwell suspected she might be the key to understanding what was happening in Black Hollow. The Blackwood mansion was even more imposing in daylight. Built of dark stone with Gothic Revival details, it featured pointed arch windows and decorative pinnacles that gave it the appearance of a small cathedral. Gargoyle rain spouts leered down from the corners, their expressions seeming to shift as clouds passed overhead. Silas met him at the door, impeccably dressed despite the early hour. "Judge Hartwell, I'm afraid Miriam is having one of her difficult mornings. Perhaps we could postpone." "I insist on speaking with her today, Mr. Blackwood. My investigation cannot wait for convenient timing." Reluctantly, Silas led him through a parlor filled with heavy, dark furniture and religious artifacts. Crucifixes adorned every wall, some carved from bone, others cast in tarnished silver. But what struck Hartwell most were the windows. Thick, heavy glass that seemed designed to keep something in rather than let light in. Miriam Blackwood sat in a wingback chair near the fireplace, her hands folded in her lap. She was perhaps 30 years old, with the same pale complexion as her father, but eyes that held a depth of knowledge that seemed both ancient and tormented. When she looked up at Judge Hartwell, he saw not madness, but a terrible, crushing sanity. "Miss Blackwood, I'm here to investigate some irregularities in your family's burial practices. I hope you'll answer my questions honestly." Miriam glanced toward her father, who stood in the doorway like a sentinel. "Father says I suffer from female hysteria, Judge, that my mind creates fantasies. Perhaps you should speak with him instead. I'd prefer to hear your perspective, miss." For a long moment, Miriam studied his face. Then so quietly that Silas couldn't hear from across the room, she whispered, "The third stone from the angel's wing, when he leaves." Silas stepped forward. "Miriam, you mustn't strain yourself with these official matters. Judge, perhaps we could continue this conversation in my study?" But Hartwell had heard enough. "Thank you, Miss Blackwood. I may have additional questions later." As Silas escorted him from the room, Hartwell memorized Miriam's cryptic words. The third stone from the angel's wing. It had to refer to something in the cemetery. That afternoon, while Silas was occupied with a funeral service for a recently deceased merchant, Judge Hartwell returned to the cemetery. He found the angel statue easily, a weeping figure carved from white marble that presided over the older section of the graveyard. Counting 3 stones from its left wing, he discovered a gravestone bearing the name Beloved Child of God, with no other identification. The stone appeared normal until Hartwell examined its base. There, nearly invisible unless one knew where to look, was a tiny gap between the stone and its foundation. With some effort, he managed to pry the stone loose, revealing a hollow space behind it. Inside was a leather-wrapped bundle containing what appeared to be a journal and several letters. The journal was bound in black leather and filled with Miriam Blackwood's careful handwriting. The first entry was dated 3 years earlier. October 15th, 1825. "Father says I must record our sacred work, that future generations of our bloodline will need to understand the old ways. Today we prepared Mrs. Eliza Thompson for her eternal rest. The laudanum ensured she would sleep deeply, and Dr. Crane certified her death from consumption as Father instructed. By evening, she was safely interred with the bell cord, should the Lord choose to wake her for further suffering. Father explains that only through the anguish of the living buried can the soil be sanctified and our family's strength renewed. It is an ancient practice, older than Christianity, but blessed by our own interpretation of resurrection. Christ himself lay in the tomb before rising. Should not others be given the same opportunity for purification through entombment?" Hartwell's hands shook as he continued reading. Entry after entry detailed a systematic practice of drugging victims into unconsciousness, obtaining false death certificates from a corrupt doctor, and burying people alive with the perverse justification that their suffering would somehow benefit the Blackwood family's spiritual power. The letters were even more damning. Correspondence between Silas Blackwood and Dr. Ezra Crane discussing payment for falsified death certificates, and detailed instructions on dosages of various drugs that would simulate death without actually killing the victim immediately. One letter, dated just 6 months earlier, made Hartwell's blood run cold. "Dr. Crane, the Henderson family has grown suspicious about their son Samuel's claims of hearing voices from the graves. We may need to arrange for his own sudden illness before he convinces others to investigate. I trust you can provide the usual services. The seasonal flu would be a believable cause. S. Blackwood." But it was Miriam's final journal entry that revealed the full horror of what the Blackwoods had been doing. November 12th, 1827. "I can no longer participate in Father's sacred work. Last night, when we buried the Johnson infant, Father claimed it had died of winter fever. I heard it crying beneath the earth for hours. Its voice was so small, so desperate. I went to dig it up to save it, but Father stopped me. He said the child's suffering was purifying the land for next spring's planting, that its innocent anguish would ensure our crops would grow strong. But I know the truth now. This is not God's work. We are monsters, and I am the worst of all because I have helped create this hell beneath our feet. There are 17 souls currently buried alive in our cemetery, Judge Hartwell, if you are reading this as I pray you will. 17 people who trusted us in their final moments and whom we betrayed in the most monstrous way imaginable. The bell cords are not connected to bells at all. They lead to small boxes Father has buried near each grave. When the victims try to signal for help, the ropes simply move wooden clappers against felt-lined walls, creating muffled sounds that Father dismisses as wind or settling earth. He has been collecting their final struggles, their desperate attempts to call for help like some sort of grotesque music. I have included a map of where each victim is buried and their true identities. Many are recorded under false names in the town records. God forgive me, God forgive us all. I hope someone with the power to stop this finds these words before more innocent souls are condemned to our family's madness. Attached to the journal was indeed a hand-drawn map of the cemetery, with 17 graves marked with X's and notes about when each person had been buried alive. The most recent entry was dated just 1 week earlier. Samuel Henderson, the young gravedigger who had reported hearing voices from the graves. Judge Hartwell sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had discovered. 17 people buried alive. 17 families who had grieved for loved ones who had actually died in the most horrible way imaginable, slowly suffocating in coffins 6 feet underground, while their own family members mourned above. As he carefully rewrapped the evidence, a shadow fell across the gravestone. He looked up to see Silas Blackwood standing 10 feet away, holding a shovel and wearing an expression of terrible calm. I wondered when someone would find Miriam's little confession, Silas said conversationally. She always was too soft-hearted for the sacred work, too influenced by conventional Christian thinking to understand the deeper mysteries. Hartwell slowly stood, clutching the journal to his chest. Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for murder, multiple murders. Silas smiled, a cold, predatory expression that transformed his gaunt features into something inhuman. Judge Hartwell, I'm afraid you've misunderstood the situation entirely. You see, no one in Black Hollow will believe you. Dr. Crane will testify to the natural deaths of everyone buried here. The town magistrate has been receiving generous donations to the church building fund. And as for you, he hefted the shovel meaningfully. Well, I suspect you'll be suffering from a sudden apoplectic fit. Very tragic for a man of your advanced years. Dr. Crane will be happy to provide the death certificate, and we'll give you a lovely funeral. With a bell cord, of course, just in case the Lord decides you need additional time for spiritual purification before accepting your final rest. Behind Silas, Judge Hartwell could see other figures emerging from the tree line. 2 younger men who bore the Blackwood family resemblance, and Dr. Crane himself, carrying a medical bag that undoubtedly contained whatever drug they used to simulate death. But as they approached, something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the cemetery came a sound that made everyone freeze. The clear, unmistakable ringing of multiple bells, all chiming in desperate unison. Then another sound joined it, the muffled but audible cries of human voices calling for help from beneath the earth. Silas's composed facade cracked. That's impossible. The bells aren't connected. The cords lead to 17 boxes buried next to 17 graves. Judge Hartwell interrupted, backing toward the cemetery gate. But what if your victims found a way to actually ring bells? What if their final desperate struggles somehow created a real connection to the surface? The ringing grew louder, more frantic, joined now by what sounded distinctly like fists pounding on wood from underground. Dr. Crane dropped his medical bag and ran. The 2 younger Blackwood men looked at their father in terror. Father, one of them whispered. The dead are calling. What if they're not dead anymore? What if they're angry? Silas raised the shovel toward Judge Hartwell, but his hands were shaking. This is impossible. The drugs, the suffocation, they should all be dead by now? Hartwell finished. Perhaps. Or perhaps your victims found a way to survive longer than you expected. Perhaps their will to live was stronger than your will to kill them. The bells continued ringing, a cacophony of desperate signals from beneath the frozen earth. And in that moment, Judge Hartwell realized that whether the sounds were supernatural or natural, they had given him the distraction he needed to escape and return with help. As he ran toward town, he could hear Silas Blackwood shouting orders to his sons. Dig them up, all of them, now before anyone else hears. But it was too late. The bells of Black Hollow Cemetery were ringing for the entire town to hear, and their message was unmistakable. The dead were crying out for justice, and someone would finally have to answer for the horrors buried beneath the Pennsylvania soil. Judge Hartwell burst through the doors of the town inn, clutching Miriam's journal and gasping for breath. The main room fell silent as every face turned toward him, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers who had been sharing their evening meal and discussing the strange bell sounds that had echoed through Black Hollow all afternoon. "Edmund Pike," Hartwell called to the innkeeper. "I need you to gather every able-bodied man in town. Bring shovels, lanterns, and whatever weapons you can find. We're going to dig up the cemetery tonight." A murmur of confusion and fear rippled through the room. Pike approached cautiously. "Judge, what are you saying? Dig up the cemetery? That's desecration of... There are people buried alive in that graveyard." Hartwell interrupted, his voice carrying clearly through the room. 17 souls who are still breathing beneath 6 feet of earth if they haven't suffocated already. The Blackwood family has been drugging people into unconsciousness, obtaining false death certificates, and burying them alive as part of some twisted ritual. The room erupted in shocked voices and angry shouts, but one voice cut through the chaos, that of Dr. Ezra Crane, who had apparently entered through the back door during Hartwell's announcement. "Gentlemen, please," Dr. Crane said in his most professional manner. "Judge Hartwell appears to be suffering from some sort of nervous exhaustion. These accusations are the product of stress and overwork. I've seen similar cases of temporary derangement brought on by the pressures of legal work. Dr." Crane was a small, neat man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the kind of soft hands that suggested he rarely engaged in physical labor. His medical bag sat at his feet, and Hartwell noticed that the doctor's usually steady fingers were trembling slightly as he spoke. "Dr. Crane," Hartwell said, pulling out one of the letters from Miriam's cache. "Would you care to explain this correspondence? The one where Silas Blackwood requests your usual services in providing a false death certificate for Samuel Henderson?" The color drained from Dr. Crane's face. "I have no idea what forgery you've discovered, Judge, but I assure you that my medical practice has always been beyond reproach." "Then you won't mind if we examine your recent death certificates?" Hartwell pressed. "Particularly the ones for people who allegedly died of sudden illnesses, but whose families reported them as being in perfect health the day before." Before Dr. Crane could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "He won't mind at all, Judge, because I've been keeping copies." Everyone turned to see Father Marcus O'Brien, the town's Catholic priest, standing in the doorway. Father O'Brien was an elderly Irish immigrant who had served Black Hollow for over 20 years, and his presence commanded immediate respect from the largely Protestant community. "Father O'Brien," Dr. Crane said nervously, "I didn't expect to see you here tonight." "Nor I you, Doctor. Especially not after our conversation this afternoon, when you confessed your sins and begged for absolution." The priest's weathered face was grim. "Gentlemen, Doctor, Crane came to me today in a state of complete spiritual collapse. He confirmed everything Judge Hartwell has just said, and more." Dr. Crane lunged for his medical bag, but 2 of the larger farmers grabbed his arms. "Let me go. You don't understand. Silas said he would kill me if I ever spoke about our arrangement. He has ways of making people disappear." Father O'Brien approached the captured doctor with surprising gentleness. "Ezra, you told me this afternoon that you've been living in terror for 3 years, falsifying death certificates because Silas Blackwood threatened to expose your gambling debts and ruin your practice. You said you never intended for it to go this far, that you thought you were just helping him avoid proper burial fees." "I didn't know," Dr. Crane cried. "At first I thought the bodies were already dead. Silas told me he needed the certificates to avoid questions about proper medical care. It wasn't until I saw one of them moving in the coffin that I realized, God help me, I realized what we were really doing." A horrified silence fell over the room. Judge Hartwell felt his stomach clench. "You saw someone moving in their coffin?" "When?" "3 months ago. The Patterson girl, she was only 16. Silas had given her something he called sleeping medicine for her headaches, but she was supposed to recover. When they brought her to me, she was so still, so cold. I signed the certificate, but at the viewing I saw her eyelid flutter. Just once, but I saw it." "What did you do?" Father O'Brien asked gently. "I tried to tell her family, but Silas was there. He pulled me aside and said if I caused any trouble, he would reveal that I had been gambling away church funds that he had loaned me. He said the girl would die anyway from the shame of being buried alive, but if I kept quiet, at least her family could remember her as peaceful." "So you let her be buried alive," Judge Hartwell said, his voice barely containing his rage. Dr. Crane broke down completely. She had the bell cord. Silas promised she had the bell cord. He said if she woke up, she could signal and they would dig her up. I believed him. I had to believe him. Father O'Brien placed a hand on the doctor's shoulder. Ezra, show them what you brought me this afternoon. With shaking hands, Dr. Crane opened his medical bag and withdrew a small leather journal. I kept records, he whispered. Every false certificate, every date, every drug Silas used. I told myself it was to protect myself if he ever tried to betray me, but really, I think I knew someone would need this evidence someday. Judge Hartwell took the journal and quickly scanned its contents. It contained detailed medical notes about the drugs used to simulate death. Combinations of laudanum, belladonna, and other substances that would slow breathing and heart rate to nearly undetectable levels. More damning were the doctor's personal observations about the victims. One entry made Hartwell's blood run cold. Samuel Henderson administered SB's mixture at 3 p.m. Pulse weak but present at time of death certification. Burial scheduled for tomorrow morning. Note: victim's eyes responded to light stimulus even after certification. SB insists this is normal post-mortem reflex. I pray he is correct. Samuel Henderson was buried 2 days ago, Judge Hartwell said. According to this, he was definitely alive when you signed his death certificate. The room exploded into angry shouts. Men reached for coats and tools, demanding immediate action, but Edmund Pike raised his voice above the chaos. Wait! Listen! Do you hear that? Everyone fell silent. From the direction of the cemetery came the sound they had been hearing all day, but now it was unmistakable. Multiple bells ringing in patterns too deliberate to be wind, too frantic to be anything but human desperation. They're still alive, someone whispered. God in heaven, they're still alive down there. Father O'Brien crossed himself. Then we have no time to waste. Every moment we delay could mean another soul lost to suffocation. Judge Hartwell organized the men quickly. They would need shovels, lanterns, ropes, and medical supplies, as well as weapons in case the Blackwood family attempted to stop the rescue. Dr. Crane, despite his complicity, would be needed to treat any survivors they found. As they prepared to leave for the cemetery, Dr. Crane grabbed Judge Hartwell's arm. Judge, there's something else you need to know. Silas doesn't just drug strangers or travelers. According to his letters, he's been practicing on his own family for years. His wife didn't die of consumption 5 years ago. She discovered what he was doing and threatened to go to the authorities. You're saying he buried his own wife alive? I'm saying she may still be down there. Her grave is in the family plot behind the mansion. Silas visits it every night, and I've seen him carrying fresh air tubes and food. Judge, I think Martha Blackwood has been imprisoned in her own grave for 5 years, kept alive as some sort of twisted trophy of his power. The implications hit Judge Hartwell like a physical blow. If Silas Blackwood was capable of burying his own wife alive and keeping her imprisoned underground for years, then the 17 victims they knew about might only be the beginning. How many other graves contained living prisoners? How long had this been going on? As the group of armed townsmen moved toward the cemetery, the bells continued their desperate ringing. But now Judge Hartwell thought he could hear something else in their rhythm, not just calls for help, but a warning. The bells seemed to be saying that the Blackwood family's horrors went deeper than anyone had imagined, and that the living prisoners buried beneath Black Hollow were just the visible portion of a darkness that had been growing in the Pennsylvania soil for longer than anyone realized. Behind them, Dr. Crane stumbled along, muttering prayers and clutching his medical bag. 17 that I know of, he whispered to Father O'Brien. But Silas has been here for 15 years, and he brought practices from the old country. Dear God, how many graves are there? How many people are still alive down there? As they reached the cemetery gates, the bells suddenly fell silent. In the distance, they could see lantern light moving between the headstones. The Blackwood family was already there, working frantically to dig up graves before anyone could discover their victims alive. But it was too late for concealment. The people of Black Hollow had heard the bells. They had the evidence, and they were coming with shovels and righteous anger to unearth the truth. The question now was whether they would find survivors, or whether they would only find the horrifying evidence of the most monstrous crimes ever committed in the Pennsylvania wilderness. The cemetery gates stood open like the mouth of some ancient beast, exhaling mist and the sounds of frantic digging. As Judge Hartwell led the armed townspeople through the entrance, their lanterns revealed a scene of desperate activity. The Blackwood family was working in the darkness, using shovels and pickaxes to excavate graves with the fury of people who knew their time was running out. Silas Blackwood looked up from where he was shoveling dirt beside a fresh grave, his gaunt face streaked with soil and sweat. Behind him, his two sons, Marcus and Isaiah, were dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas toward the tree line. In the flickering light, Judge Hartwell caught a glimpse of what looked like a human arm hanging limply from the bundle. "Stop right there!" Hartwell shouted, raising the pistol he had borrowed from the innkeeper. "Release whatever you're carrying and step away from the graves." Silas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Judge Hartwell, how convenient that you've brought me more subjects for our sacred work. The soil hasn't been properly nourished in weeks." The townspeople spread out in a line, their faces grim in the lantern light. Many were fathers and husbands who had buried loved ones in this very cemetery, and the thought that their family members might have been buried alive had transformed their usual evening calm into barely controlled rage. "Edmund Pike," Judge Hartwell called to the innkeeper, "take 5 men and check on what those boys are dragging. The rest of us will secure Silas and begin digging up the graves marked on Miriam's map." But as Pike and his group moved toward the Blackwood sons, a new voice cut through the night air. High, desperate, and unmistakably female. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" The voice was coming from directly beneath their feet. Everyone froze, staring down at the ground in horror. The voice came again, muffled but clearly audible through the earth. "I'm in the Patterson grave. Mary Patterson. I'm still alive. Please dig me up." Dr. Crane stumbled forward, his face white with terror. "That's impossible. I signed her death certificate 3 months ago. She can't still be." "Alive?" Silas Blackwood completed the sentence, his smile growing wider. "Oh, but she is, Doctor. They all are. You see, the drugs you helped me administer don't just simulate death, they preserve life. Slow the metabolism, reduce oxygen needs, allow the body to survive on minimal resources. Mary Patterson has been conscious in her coffin for 3 months, kept alive by the air tubes I've been secretly maintaining." Judge Hartwell felt sick. "You've been keeping her alive down there? For 3 months? The soil demands living sacrifice, Judge. Dead bodies provide no spiritual nourishment, but the slow, conscious suffering of the buried alive that sanctifies the earth in ways you couldn't possibly understand. Mary Patterson's anguish has made our land more fertile than it's been in generations." From beneath the ground, Mary Patterson's voice rose again, weaker now but still audible. "Please, I can't. The air's running out. Please." "Start digging," Judge Hartwell commanded. "Every grave on this map, now." The townspeople attacked the earth with desperate efficiency. Shovels bit into frozen soil as men worked in pairs, passing lanterns and tools, calling out encouragement to any victims who might hear them. The sound of Mary Patterson's voice seemed to give them supernatural strength, knowing that at least one person was definitely alive down there, suffering through each moment they delayed. But as they dug, Silas Blackwood continued his horrifying explanation, speaking as calmly as if he were discussing the weather. "The old ways, Judge, demand sacrifice. When my family came from Moravia, we brought ancient knowledge, how to feed the land with living energy, how to ensure good harvests through the controlled suffering of human souls. The local pastor in our homeland understood, blessed our rituals, helped us choose appropriate subjects." "You're insane," Father O'Brien said, working beside the diggers. "This isn't religious practice, it's pure evil." "Evil?" Silas laughed again. "Father, your own Bible speaks of God's demand for sacrifice. Abraham and Isaac, the crucifixion itself, suffering and death in service of higher purpose. We simply refined the process, learned to sustain life while providing the spiritual benefits of burial." From the Patterson grave came the sound of shovels hitting wood. "We've reached the coffin," one of the men called out. Mary, can you hear us? We're going to get you out." A weak tapping sound came from inside the coffin, the sound of fingernails against wood, barely audible but unmistakably human. As the men worked to pry open the coffin lid, Dr. Crane prepared his medical supplies, though his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his instruments. "Judge!" Edmund Pike's voice called from across the cemetery. "You need to see this." Pike and his men had intercepted the Blackwood sons and unwrapped their canvas bundle. What they found made several of the men step back in revulsion. It was Samuel Henderson, the young gravedigger, but he was alive, barely breathing, his fingernails torn and bloody from clawing at his coffin lid. "Sweet Jesus," Pike whispered. "How long has he been like this?" Samuel's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have aged him years in just days. His lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words through a throat raw from screaming. Dr. Crane rushed over with his medical bag. "Get him wrapped in blankets and give him small sips of water. Don't let him drink too much at once. His system has been under extreme stress." As the doctor worked to stabilize Samuel, the young man finally managed to speak in a voice like rustling leaves. "Others, still down there, Mrs. Blackwood, in the family plot. She's been there for years." Judge Hartwell felt his blood turn to ice. "Mrs. Blackwood, Martha Blackwood." Samuel nodded weakly. "Visits her, every night. Takes her food, talks to her through a tube. She begs him to let her die." "You lie," Silas roared, lunging toward Samuel with his shovel raised. But 3 townsmen tackled him to the ground, pinning him as he struggled and cursed. From the Patterson grave came a creaking sound as the coffin lid was finally pried open. Mary Patterson lay inside, her dress rotted, her hair matted, but her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her eyes opened as lantern light fell across her face, and she tried to speak but could only manage a weak sob. "Easy, Mary," Dr. Crane said gently as he knelt beside the coffin. "You're safe now. We're going to get you out of there." As they carefully lifted Mary from her coffin prison, Judge Hartwell organized the remaining men to continue digging. The map Miriam had provided showed 17 graves, and if Samuel's condition was any indication, time was running desperately short for the other victims. "Judge," Father O'Brien called from where he was working on another grave. "This headstone says James Morrison died of fever, but the Morrison family told me yesterday that James left town 6 months ago to find work in Philadelphia. They've been waiting for a letter from him." The horrible realization was spreading through the group. How many of the departed they had mourned were actually prisoners in underground coffins? How many families had grieved for loved ones who were suffering in unimaginable torment just feet beneath the funeral services? As they dug deeper into James Morrison's grave, they could hear tapping from inside the coffin, weak, but definitely present. When they opened it, they found a man so emaciated and pale he looked like a living skeleton. But his eyes were alert and filled with desperate gratitude. "6 months," he whispered as they lifted him out. 6 months. In the dark, listening to my own funeral, hearing my mother cry. The revelations continued as they opened grave after grave. Some contained bodies too decomposed to have survived, but others held victims who had somehow endured weeks or months of burial through the Blackwoods' twisted system of air tubes and minimal feeding. Each rescue revealed new horrors. People who had been conscious during their own burial services, who had listened to eulogies while trapped in coffins, who had spent endless dark hours scratching messages into their wooden prisons. But it was when they reached the family plot behind the mansion that they made the most horrifying discovery of all. Martha Blackwood's grave was elaborate, a carved marble headstone declaring her a beloved wife and mother, with dates showing she had died 5 years earlier. But when they began digging, they quickly discovered that this grave was different from the others. Instead of a simple coffin 6 feet down, they found an elaborate underground chamber. Wooden stairs led down to a small room lined with stone, furnished with a crude bed, a bucket, and shelves holding rotting food. In the corner, connected to the surface by a hidden tube, was a woman. Martha Blackwood was alive, but what 5 years of underground imprisonment had done to her was almost worse than death. Her hair had gone completely white. Her skin was translucent from lack of sunlight, and her eyes held the vacant stare of someone whose mind had been shattered by prolonged isolation and terror. When she saw the lantern light and the faces of the rescuers, she didn't speak. She simply began laughing, a high, broken sound that spoke of sanity, completely destroyed. "Martha," Father O'Brien said gently, climbing down into the chamber. "Martha, it's Father O'Brien. We're here to help you. You're going to be free now." She stopped laughing and tilted her head like a curious bird. "Free?" she whispered. "But Silas says I can never be free. I know his secrets. I know about the others. He keeps me here to remind me that this is what happens to wives who try to leave their husbands." As they carefully helped Martha from her underground prison, Silas's composure finally cracked completely. "You don't understand," he screamed, struggling against the men holding him. "She was going to expose our sacred work. She would have destroyed generations of spiritual practice. I gave her a choice: stay and serve the family's divine mission, or join the others in proper burial. So you buried your own wife alive and kept her as a prisoner for 5 years," Judge Hartwell said, his voice deadly quiet. "What kind of monster does that to the woman he married?" "A monster who understands that some knowledge is too dangerous for the weak-minded," Silas replied. "Martha learned about our practices when she found the feeding tubes and air systems. Instead of embracing the sacred nature of our work, she threatened to run to the authorities. What choice did I have?" Dr. Crane, who had been moving between the rescued victims providing medical care, finally spoke up. "Silas, I've been documenting everything for my own protection. I have records going back 3 years. 47 false death certificates, including your wife's. 47 people you've buried alive." The number hit everyone like a physical blow. 47 victims. They had rescued 12 tonight, found 8 bodies too decomposed to have survived, but that meant— "Where are the others?" Judge Hartwell demanded. 27 people are still unaccounted for. Where are they?" Silas smiled that terrible, cold smile again. "Some secrets, Judge, go to the grave. And some graves, well, they're not in this cemetery." As dawn approached, the full scope of the Blackwood family's crimes was becoming clear. They had been operating not just a funeral home, but a systematic program of kidnapping, false burial, and prolonged torture that had claimed dozens of victims over more than a decade. The cemetery they had excavated was only one site. There were others, hidden throughout the Pennsylvania wilderness, where more victims might still be suffering in underground prisons. But even as they prepared to transport the rescued victims to town for medical care and begin searching for additional burial sites, Judge Hartwell knew that the most disturbing question remained unanswered. How had an entire community allowed this to happen? How many people had noticed strange sounds, unusual digging, or suspicious deaths, but said nothing out of fear or willful blindness? As Martha Blackwood was helped into a wagon, still laughing her broken laugh, Judge Hartwell realized that the Blackwood family's legacy of horror would haunt Black Hollow for generations to come. The physical rescues were only the beginning. The psychological and spiritual damage would take much longer to heal, and somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, 27 more victims might still be waiting for rescue, buried alive in graves that hadn't been found yet, counting the hours and praying that someone would hear their desperate calls for help before it was too late. 3 days after the cemetery excavations, Judge Hartwell sat in the converted town hall that now served as both a medical station and interrogation center. The 12 survivors were slowly recovering under Dr. Crane's care, though several might never fully regain their physical or mental health after their underground ordeals. Martha Blackwood remained the most severely affected, alternating between periods of lucid terror and complete dissociation from reality. But it was Miriam Blackwood who held the key to finding the remaining 27 victims. Since her father's arrest, she had been cooperating fully with the investigation, though each revelation seemed to drain more life from her already pale features. "The cemetery was just the beginning, Judge," she said, seated across from him with her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Father established what he called feeding stations throughout the forest, places where he could keep victims alive for extended periods while determining their spiritual value. She had brought with her a detailed map drawn on several sheets of paper, showing locations scattered across miles of wilderness. Some were marked with symbols indicating the number of victims buried at each site, others with notes about the specific experiments conducted there." "Experiments?" Judge Hartwell asked, though he dreaded the answer. Father believed that different types of suffering produced different spiritual benefits. At the cemetery, victims were kept in standard coffins with minimal air and food. Their desperation was meant to sanctify the soil for normal burials. But at the remote sites, she paused, closing her eyes as if gathering strength to continue. At the remote sites, he tested other methods, Some victims were buried in chambers filled with different depths of water, to see if the fear of drowning enhanced their spiritual output. Others were placed in coffins with glass tops, so they could see the sky but never reach it. The most isolated site contains what Father called his resurrection chamber, a buried room where he kept people for years, bringing them to the edge of death repeatedly before reviving them. Judge Hartwell felt sick. How many people did he subject to these experiments? The map shows locations for 43 additional victims beyond those at the cemetery, but her voice became barely a whisper. Some of the remote sites have been active for over 10 years. Father inherited the practices from his own father, who brought them from the old country. This has been happening for generations. The scope of the Blackwood family's crimes was expanding beyond anything Judge Hartwell had imagined. This wasn't just an isolated case of serial murder. It was a multi-generational system of torture and imprisonment that had claimed potentially hundreds of victims over decades. Miriam, I need you to guide us to these sites. Every day we delay could mean more deaths. She nodded, but her next words chilled him further. Judge, there's something else you need to understand. Father didn't work alone. The system was too complex, required too many resources. He had partners. Partners? Other families, practicing similar rituals in other regions. They would trade victims sometimes, share techniques, compare results. Father corresponded regularly with practitioners in Ohio, Virginia, and the Carolinas. This wasn't unique to Black Hollow. It was part of a network. Judge Hartwell stared at the map, realizing that what they had uncovered might be just one branch of a vast underground network of families practicing ritualized burial torture throughout the eastern United States. The implications were staggering. We need to organize search parties immediately, he decided. Every site on this map needs to be excavated, starting with the most recent ones where victims might still be alive. The first remote site was located 2 miles northeast of town, in a clearing surrounded by thick pine forest. Miriam's map indicated it had been used within the past 6 months and contained 3 subjects in progressive stages of spiritual refinement. When the search party arrived, they found what appeared to be an ordinary forest clearing. But Miriam led them to specific spots where the ground showed subtle signs of disturbance, areas where the soil was slightly different in color, where the grass grew in unusual patterns, where small wooden stakes were barely visible among the undergrowth. The stakes mark air tube locations, Miriam explained. Father was careful to maintain life support systems for long-term subjects. He believed that victims who died too quickly provided minimal spiritual benefit. As they began digging at the first marked location, they quickly discovered a wooden trapdoor hidden beneath a layer of soil and leaves. When opened, it revealed a narrow shaft leading down to what appeared to be a buried wooden chamber. Judge Hartwell lowered a lantern into the opening and called out, "Hello, is anyone down there? We're here to help." The response came immediately, a weak but unmistakably human voice calling back, "Please, oh God, please help us. We've been here for months." The chamber below contained 3 people in various stages of physical deterioration, 2 women and 1 man, all emaciated but alive, chained to walls in a space barely large enough for them to lie down. The stench of human waste and decay was overwhelming, but the victims were conscious and coherent enough to speak. "How long have you been here?" Dr. Crane asked as they worked to free the prisoners. "I don't know," one of the women replied. "Months, maybe longer." The tall man brings food sometimes, talks about purification through suffering. He said our anguish was making the forest stronger. As they helped the victims to the surface, Miriam continued her disturbing explanations. This was one of Father's meditation sites. He would come here when he needed to refresh his spiritual energy, to listen to the suffering and commune with what he believed were ancient powers. The second site, marked on the map as containing water purification subjects, revealed an even more horrific scene. Here, the Blackwoods had constructed underground chambers that could be partially flooded, forcing victims to stand in cold water that gradually rose and fell according to some predetermined schedule. They found 2 people still alive in these chambers, a middle-aged man and a teenage boy, both suffering from severe exposure and psychological trauma. The man had been there for over a year, the boy for 6 months. Both spoke of long periods standing in freezing water, never knowing when the level would rise enough to drown them. sustained by minimal food and the desperate hope that someone would eventually find them. The water was meant to simulate drowning, Miriam explained as they helped the survivors. Father believed that the fear of death by drowning produced particularly pure spiritual energy. He would adjust the water levels to bring victims to the edge of panic without actually killing them. But it was the third sight that revealed the full extent of Silas Blackwood's madness. The resurrection chamber was located in a natural cave that had been extensively modified and expanded. Wooden stairs led down into a complex underground facility with multiple rooms, each designed for specific types of psychological and physical torture. The main chamber contained what could only be described as a primitive laboratory: tables with restraints, shelves lined with bottles of various drugs and chemicals, detailed charts documenting the effects of different torture techniques on human subjects. The walls were covered with Silas's handwritten notes describing his research into the spiritual benefits of sustained human suffering. But most disturbing were the occupied cells they found deeper in the cave system. 7 people were imprisoned here, some who had been captive for years. They had been subjected to repeated near-death experiences, drugged to the point of apparent death, buried for varying periods, then revived and questioned about their experiences in the liminal space between life and death. He wanted to know what happened to the soul during burial. One survivor explained in a voice barely above a whisper. He would drug us until we stopped breathing, bury us in coffins for hours, then dig us up and revive us. Then he would ask us what we saw, what we felt, whether we had visions of the afterlife. The victim, a woman named Sarah Collins who had disappeared from a neighboring town 3 years earlier, continued her account. He kept detailed records of everything: how long we could survive burial, what drugs worked best, how the experience changed our spiritual state. He said he was mapping the boundary between life and death, trying to harness the power that exists in that transition. Judge Hartwell examined Silas's research notes with growing horror. The man had been conducting systematic experiments in near-death experiences, treating human beings like laboratory animals in his quest to understand and exploit what he believed were supernatural forces. "There are more sites," Miriam said as they prepared to evacuate the cave complex. Father spoke of locations in other states operated by his correspondents, families who shared his beliefs and methods. "Judge, what we've found here might be happening in dozens of other places." As they emerged from the cave with the 7 survivors, Judge Hartwell realized that the Blackwood case had evolved far beyond a local crime investigation. They were dealing with what appeared to be an organized network of families practicing ritualized torture and murder across multiple states, all connected by shared beliefs about the spiritual power of human suffering. The immediate priority was finding and rescuing the remaining victims marked on Miriam's maps. But the larger question loomed: how many other communities were harboring similar secrets? How many other families were burying people alive in the name of spiritual enlightenment? As they loaded the survivors into wagons for transport back to town, Judge Hartwell made a decision that would change the course of the investigation. He would need to contact federal authorities, share Miriam's evidence about the interstate network, and coordinate a massive search operation across multiple states. The Blackwood family's reign of terror in Black Hollow was ending, but the fight against the larger network of ritualized torture was just beginning. Somewhere in the wilderness of Ohio, Virginia, and the Carolinas, other victims were waiting in underground chambers, counting the hours and praying that someone would hear their desperate calls for help. The bells of Black Hollow had finally stopped ringing, but their message had been heard far beyond Pennsylvania. The hunt for the rest of the network was about to begin. 6 months after the first excavations at Black Hollow Cemetery, Judge Hartwell stood in a federal courthouse in Philadelphia, watching as the final verdicts were read in what newspapers had dubbed the Blackwood Horror. The investigation had expanded across 7 states, resulting in the discovery of over 200 victims and the arrest of 12 families involved in what authorities now understood to be a multi-generational network of ritualized torture. Silas Blackwood sat in the defendant's chair, his gaunt frame even thinner after months in prison, but his eyes still holding that terrible, cold intelligence. When the judge pronounced the death sentence, Silas simply smiled, the same predatory expression that had haunted Judge Hartwell's nightmares for months. The court finds the defendant guilty of 47 counts of murder in the first degree, 63 counts of kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit murder across state lines, the federal judge announced. Silas Blackwood, You are hereby sentenced to death by hanging, sentenced to be carried out within 30 days. But even as justice was finally served, Judge Hartwell knew that the full scope of the Blackwood Network's crimes might never be completely understood. The investigation had revealed burial sites scattered across hundreds of miles of wilderness, some containing evidence of ritualized torture dating back 50 years or more. Miriam Blackwood had cooperated fully with authorities, providing maps, letters, and detailed testimony that led to the discovery of additional victims and the arrest of collaborating families. In exchange for her cooperation, she had received a reduced sentence of 20 years in prison. A controversial decision that had divided public opinion. Dr. Ezra Crane had been sentenced to life imprisonment for his role in providing false death certificates and medical support for the torture network. During his trial, he had revealed additional details about the scope of the conspiracy, including the existence of corrupt medical professionals in other states who had provided similar services to other families. The survivors, those who had been rescued from underground chambers and burial sites, faced long, difficult recoveries. Many would never fully regain their physical health after months or years of underground imprisonment. The psychological trauma ran even deeper, with some survivors requiring permanent institutional care. Martha Blackwood remained in a private sanatorium, her mind permanently shattered by 5 years of underground captivity. She had lucid moments when she could provide testimony about her husband's crimes, but most of the time she existed in a state of dissociation, her laughter echoing through the hospital corridors like a ghost from the Pennsylvania wilderness. As Judge Hartwell prepared to return to Black Hollow for the final phase of the investigation, he received an unexpected visitor in his Philadelphia hotel room. Father Marcus O'Brien had traveled from Pennsylvania with disturbing news. "Judge, there's something you need to see," the elderly priest said, producing a letter written on expensive paper. This arrived at the church yesterday, addressed to the authorities investigating the sacred work. Judge Hartwell read the letter with growing unease. "To those who have disrupted the ancient practices in Black Hollow, you believe you have ended something, but you have merely pruned a branch from a tree whose roots run deeper than you can imagine." The Blackwood family was only one chapter in a story that began centuries ago in the old country and will continue long after your small victory is forgotten. The work of spiritual purification through controlled suffering is not the invention of madmen, but the preservation of sacred knowledge passed down through generations of families who understand the true nature of the boundary between life and death. What you call torture, we call enlightenment. What you call murder, we call transformation. 47 souls were guided through the sacred transition in Black Hollow, but hundreds more await their turn in locations you will never find. The network extends far beyond the families you have arrested. We have learned from your investigation, adapted our methods, moved our operations to more secure locations. The bells you heard ringing in Black Hollow Cemetery were not calls for help. They were signals of successful transformation, announcements that another soul had achieved the spiritual purification that comes only through conscious burial. Those you call victims were willing participants in their own elevation to a higher state of being. Judge Hartwell, you and your fellow investigators have succeeded only in forcing us to be more careful, more selective, more sophisticated in our methods. The sacred work continues, and it will continue long after you have joined the ranks of those who have experienced the ultimate spiritual transformation. The families send their regards and their promise that the ancient practices will endure, the keepers of the sacred transition. Father O'Brien watched Judge Hartwell's face as he read. "Judge, there's more. 3 families disappeared from surrounding counties last week, entire households, including children, and there have been reports of strange digging sounds in forests across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia. I fear the network is not only still active, but expanding." Judge Hartwell felt the familiar chill that had haunted him since his first night in Black Hollow. The investigation had revealed and dismantled one branch of the network, but the letter suggested that other families were still practicing their ritualized torture, perhaps with even greater care and sophistication, to avoid detection. "Father, we need to contact federal authorities immediately. If the network is regrouping and expanding, we need a coordinated response across multiple states." "There's something else, Judge." The letter was postmarked from Black Hollow itself. "Someone is still here, still watching, still practicing the sacred work right under our noses. That night, Judge Hartwell found himself walking through the reconstructed Black Hollow Cemetery one final time. The excavated graves had been properly reburied after the investigation, and memorial stones had been erected for the identified victims. The Blackwood mansion stood empty, its windows boarded, its Gothic architecture looking even more sinister in the moonlight. But as he walked among the headstones, Judge Hartwell heard something that made his blood freeze, the faint, distant sound of a bell ringing in the forest beyond the cemetery. The sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic, followed by what might have been a muffled cry for help carried on the night wind. Somewhere in the Pennsylvania wilderness, the sacred work was continuing. Judge Hartwell drew his pistol and moved toward the sound, knowing that the investigation he thought had ended was actually just beginning. The Blackwood family's reign of terror in Black Hollow had been stopped, but the network they belonged to had evolved, adapted, and moved deeper underground. As he disappeared into the dark forest, following the sound of the bells, Judge Hartwell carried with him the knowledge that some evils are too deeply rooted to be completely destroyed. They can only be fought, one victim at a time, one burial site at a time, by people willing to listen for the desperate ringing of bells that should never ring. Behind him, the empty Blackwood mansion seemed to watch his progress into the wilderness, its boarded windows like closed eyes that might open at any moment to witness the continuation of horrors that had plagued the Pennsylvania soil for generations. In the distance, the bells continued ringing, not the sound of wind on metal but the deliberate, desperate signal of someone buried alive, calling out to anyone brave enough to dig them up before it was too late. The ghastly history of the Blackwood family had ended, but the story of the sacred work continued somewhere in the darkness, where other families kept other victims in underground chambers, waiting for their own spiritual transformation through the slow agony of conscious burial. And in the federal courthouse in Philadelphia, Silas Blackwood's execution date approached, but his cold smile suggested that even death would not end his family's contribution to the ancient practices that had claimed so many innocent lives in the forests of Pennsylvania and beyond. The investigation was closed, but the hunt for the rest of the network had only just begun.